Welcome to the What is Public History Now conference. And I'm Julia Laite, and I'm the one who kind of got the funding to put this together. And the reason I got that funding is because I was tasked with starting a public history program at Birkbeck, here at Birkbeck. Welcome to Birkbeck, by the way. And I just thought it was kind of high time that folks got together and talked about the real surge in interest in public history all around the UK, both within and outside of the university. And so that's the idea, and we're going to talk about what public history is, what it could be, what we don't want it to be, and all sorts of other things. And so this is the first panel, and it's titled "What is Public History Now?" And we're going to talk about. We've got three speakers who are going to talk about what they think public history might be. And I also just wanted to draw your attention to an engagement expectation that we have, which is that we want this event to be kind and curious and open to discussion. And we want everyone to be mindful that discussing histories can be challenging, emotive, and subjective, and that everyone's experience is different. So try and be clear when you're speaking about your experience, and of course respectful when others are speaking to theirs. And if you need any support following any of these sessions, you can reach out to Allison or myself, and we can connect you with resources. There'll be no tolerance for racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, or otherwise prejudiced language and ideas. So that's just something we wanted to announce in advance. And when referring to people in the third person, please be mindful of any pronouns. And if in doubt, try to use a neutral they. And you can always ask somebody in private if you want to clarify. And because this conference endeavors to bring public historians of all different backgrounds together, I just wanted to let everyone know to try to avoid jargon or overly kind of specific professional language, and we'll try to speak to each other across boundaries, hopefully. Right, so I will invite our speakers up to the stage. Sorry, you don't need to climb. I did jump off this once, thinking it was a lot lower. If you just want to come up to the stage. Unfortunately, Dia Gupta cannot be with us this morning. We tried to bring her in on video link, and the technology failed us this morning. But have a look on our blog in the future, because she's going to send her. Oh, sorry, you need to get past it. She's going to send her ideas via blog. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for the first panel. Jessica Moody, who will speak first, is Senior Lecturer in Public History at the University of Bristol, and she's previously worked at Portsmouth in York and for National Museums in Liverpool. And her research interests are the public memory of difficult histories, including enslavement and empire, and of creative and co-produced methods of public history and memorialization. And next we will hear from Barbara Wood, who is a curatorial practitioner. Originally an archaeologist, she's worked in national, local, and community museums, taught museum studies, public history, and archaeology, and led projects for museums, historic sites, heritage, and arts. And she is currently the Cultural Heritage Coordinator in National Trust, Southwest Region, working with portable collections, landscapes, domestic, agricultural, and industrial buildings, which is very cool. And finally,
curator, not coordinator.
Oh, did I say coordinator? Curator.
Although that sounds really interesting.
Sorry, I meant to say curator.
Choreographer.
Or choreographer. And finally, Dr. Wanda Wyporska is Chief Executive of the Society of Genealogists, the author of Witchcraft in early modern Poland, 1500 to 1800, which was shortlisted for the Catherine Briggs Folklore Award. And she's a passionate advocate for history. A frequent keynote speaker and media commentator, a visiting research fellow at the University of York, and she was a Starran Senior Scholar at Hertford College, Oxford. Okay, I will pass this microphone to you, Jessica, to get us started explaining what public history is. No pressure.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's great to be here. It's really nice to be around people who work and think about these topics every day in their professional lives. I really look forward to talking to you more later. I suppose, and in addition to the introduction from Julia, I just wanted to position myself a little bit more in my response. I suppose just to emphasise that I speak as someone who predominantly researches and teaches public history in higher education. And I suppose just thinking about my background, intellectually similar to Barbara in a way, I come from an archaeology background. That's was my undergraduate degree, and I met the world of public history and this terminology and language of public history, initially, I suppose, through heritage. I did an MA in Cultural Heritage Management, and I think this sort of speaks to this complicated terminology landscape of public history, particularly in the UK, where there are all these other ways that public history has been done across the years, and we think about things like oral history, as well as this long history of public engagements with the past. And so, but for me personally, I come at this through heritage studies, and then the emerging field of critical heritage studies that have developed across the last 20 years. And then I merged into memory studies, so I've sort of jumped around all of these different sort of subfields that relate to this topic in different ways, and that was the discipline in history, in the history department that I did my PhD under. As Julie said, I've also previously worked in museums, and again I've just emphasised that my research has to date mostly concerned Britain's public memory of transatlantic enslavement, but I also have research interests in the representation of difficult histories more broadly, as well as creative forms of memorialisation and the ways that this can be co-created and co-produced. And I've also taught on various public history themed units and courses for the last 8 years or so, and I think it's quite interesting to think about how that's changed over time. So, with this in mind, I do think that public history, however we're sort of determining it, is at a really interesting, if complicated, juncture at the moment. And I suppose I maybe place more emphasis on them now in the question rather than what is UK public history.
That's fine.
So, for me, I think there are some really exciting developments, things to get really excited about at the moment, which concern approaches and methods in public history, and the fairly dramatic shifts that there have been in the inclusion of previously undertold stories. So around methods, or sort of ways of doing public history, I think we've seen the development of, and largely mainstream adoption of collaborative methodologies, of co-creation and co-production, of involving different people in the making of public history for a number of years now. And this has also been the focus of, increasingly the focus of academic research as well, into how those processes are undertaken, perhaps thinking a little bit more critically about that, thinking about questions of voice and power in the process of making histories collaboratively, of arguably perhaps sharing authority, as Michael Fish might have said back in 1990. But this, of course, has not come without complications. And there is some really interesting work to be done, and indeed is being done, around critically analysing these processes. Secondly, we've also seen what we might tentatively, though not uncritically, consider the decolonial turn in public history. The drive to decolonise institutions and historical narratives, a process which calls not just for critical attention on perspectives, omissions and mythologies within histories presented themselves, but also around the core of institutional cultures and representation within heritage bodies, places and organisations more broadly. And so, just coming again from my own sort of research perspective, in relation to the public history of transatlantic enslavement in Britain, for example, there are more places and sites which are making connections to this history more publicly known, and some of which are doing this for the first time. And whilst this trend has been in motion, especially within the port cities historically in Britain, Liverpool, Bristol, London, since the 1980s, and was spurred on partially by the nationally marked bicentenary of the abolition of the British Slave Trade Act in 2007, recent impetus has also come from academic research, such as the large-scale database of compensation payments made at the time of emancipation to the enslavers, not the enslaved, as mapped by the Legacies of British Slave Trade Ownership project at UCL, and most recently by the killing of George Floyd in 2020, and subsequent public activism and protests, including, of course, myself in my hometown, the pulling down of the statue of the slave merchant at Colston. And so out of this activism and context, institutions such as the National Trust, but not just, Also a wide range of organisations from pubs and civic buildings to the Church of England have launched projects and published reports into connections between their properties, people connected with those institutions, and transatlantic enslavement, empire and colonialism. So this, one of the sort of knock-on effects of this, particularly from 2020, has brought about a much more pronounced dialogue about history, memory, and public space, and it's brought this quite urgently into public discourse. And so these sorts of topics that I found that I would introduce to first-year history students, often for the first time, that they'd be coming across these ideas, you know, about how memory is a mirror to present-day contexts, of memory and power, of how who is remembered in public spaces is a selective process, were very quickly very mainstream. And in many ways, there is a much more literate conversation in some sections of society about these issues and the ideas behind them. However, there's always a however. All of this dynamic change and public history work has been and continues to be undertaken under challenging circumstances, in the midst of a bitter, albeit largely artificially engineered, so-called culture war, spurred on by sections of the right-wing media and our own government, and rages over the public memory of histories of race, enslavement and empire, but extends also to topics relating to identity around gender and sexuality. So what does this mean for us as public historians and people who are connected to that kind of work, either through research or teaching? For the people working at the coalface of bringing lesser-known histories and connections to light in the public space, who often find themselves personally implicated in critical debates over the representation of this past, and this is especially true for women and people of colour. Whilst it's true that there's nothing particularly new that histories of race and enslavement might be used in this way, to engineer division and difference and tension, and there is a history of enslavement being a usable past in this way that goes back to the 19th century, the tone of these current culture wars presents a distinct challenge for public historians and those of us associated with this work. In doing this kind of difficult public historical work, how do we navigate questions of care and ethics for those involved and affected by this? How do we navigate institutional nervousness under the gaze of political criticism, policy change and legal challenge? And how do we support each other whilst maintaining momentum of meaningful change? So those are some questions to think about.
Thank you so much. Hi. Morning. Let's look at that one first, actually. But
Oh, okay, so that, this
yeah,
one?
no, the other one.
That's
fine. Yeah. Just shift to the side. So thank you. Right, thank you. I've never referred to myself or my work with the words public history, and I'm interested to see how it's discussed here, because of course what I did for the conference was going to look at the definition, and it seemed that perhaps I am a public historian, or maybe I have been, or maybe I will be again. So in being asked to reflect on what is public history now, I of course considered it particularly in relation to my own working context, which one way or another has been in heritage. And there's a lot of crossover here with what Jessica's saying, actually, because heritage is a term which, perhaps in a similar way to public history, is widely used and difficult to define. And there's lots of similarities in how the two are described, and particularly in the early days of how the concept of heritage was discussed, if you look back at papers and discussions of the late 70s and 80s. So having thought more about what heritage is in my own work, I'll start there. So I take heritage to be an action, the activity or the work of heritage. So that is all of the activity which is done with and around or generated from the assets that remain to us from the past. So not the objects, the places or the things, but it's what we do with them. So that for me is the work of heritage. And that work changes between people, between generations, between interests, but it's wide and it's all-encompassing. It includes the activity of the academic, the curator, community activist, family historian or hobby collector. So many people kind of do heritage in their own lives or wherever. They do it formally and informally, in isolation or communally, whether curating a collection, investigating a subject of interest, reenacting or finding work in the sector, caring, conserving or interpreting material, or in creating the experiences which are generated from the historical assets, or managing the facilities and services which support the sector. Taking this viewpoint, heritage is about how people, anyone, all of us, use the past and the present, and therefore understanding heritage is perhaps important for an understanding of the idea of public history. So I've got two ways of thinking about this idea, public history. First, I've spent my working life in the heritage sector. So, as has been described, I've worked in archaeology, in museums and with collections, for historic environment record services, historic sites, buildings, gardens and with grant funders. All the kind of things that I think of as for public benefit. So that means that I've also worked with the activities and outputs that are generated by or from those resources, whether those are portable collections, material and personal culture, or whether they're places, building, monuments, coastlines or landscapes. And that might be exhibitions, events and all of the activities that fall within a public programme. It could be workshops, formal learning support and the provision of informal and lifelong learning, specialist tours, family Saturday clubs, walks and talks and publications. It's also meant community programmes, building partnership activities and plans, developing outreach services and connecting with traditional and what are defined as hard to reach groups. Hard to reach for all different reasons, of course. It's meant supporting volunteer museums, community history groups and events, talking with metal detectorists, attending history fairs and developing the relationships with those who want to donate to collections. It's meant for the work that I've done also assessing funding applications from national institutions and tiny local projects and mentoring those projects to ensure that they're about public benefit and involvement, as well as about caring for and sharing historical assets. When I began, that work was all undertaken by myself and my colleagues with a strong sense that we were performing a public service. This was very much the language and the ethos, particularly when many of us were employed by local authorities. Our job was to make sure that our collections benefited those who funded, supported and visited, or who used the services, classes, education, learning or entertainment, and also those who never visited. It was always important to answer queries, share knowledge, provide access to collections for research, as well as by exhibition, and to support and extend the use of collections by others. And I certainly came into the sector at a time when we were trained to see ourselves in that way. I've also seen it as collaborative. There's always been a crossover between amateur and professional, for example, or between curator and donor, or between paid practice and community project. We know that all those disciplines come together, and it's like other sectors like conservation perhaps, or sport, where there is this merging of professional and amateur. Never know how to describe it, but those who aren't paid to do that work, and that's both productive and also sometimes challenging. So that doesn't mean that that's always been good practice. It doesn't mean that what is the best practice that we would look to do now, and I'm speaking in very general terms. However, when things go well, I've certainly experienced a way of working that brings together those different interests, skills and experience in a shared practice that supports or delivers something which I think must be public history. In relation to my current role, I think perhaps that's different. It's perhaps, because I work for the National Trust, and that's a huge organisation with a whole lot of different tentacles. And perhaps that's a more passive form of public history. Narratives prepared, presented to support a day out that's often not particularly dependent on the history, public or otherwise, of a place. While elsewhere I may have thought that the on-site experience or direct engagement would be the key outcome, perhaps in the National Trust the impact on public history is more long-term and foundational, so it speaks to many of the things that Jessica touched on actually. So I definitely feel that the work I do is less about the immediate contact with people that it would have been in other of my jobs, and it's definitely more about long-term thinking and long-term change. One of the great tensions in all parts of the heritage sector can be in how the use of history or historical material in the present. We see that whether it's for community projects and exhibitions that reflect current interests, or the reappraisal of public collections and national historical narratives, the employment of cultural assets and information for political or personal ends, or the embracing of multiple viewpoints and meanings. There can be a tension for practitioners as what is asked of us changes as the power to influence and direct our work changes. And this is something I've explored from my other place of reflection, and that's from an academic place. In addition to applied practice, I've also thought about ideas of heritage or public history by investigating the attributes or concepts that shape and manage it. So my doctoral research looked at power in heritage, who has it, how it's used. I looked at forms of authority, the relationship of power and authority with specialist knowledge, and how the moving ownership of those attributes affect concepts of authenticity, both objects and experience. And that research was undertaken by exploring the experience of professional applied practitioners, and that's a group that almost nobody speaks to actually. And of the outcomes, there's two that I just wanted to share here. And this particular model comes from, the first one.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So I just wanted to position where I think heritage is, and I think this probably relates to public history as well. So I think a lot of the tensions in the sector that I see working within it are that there's two forms of practice operating in the same space. And one is the work of what I've always called the work of heritage, but you might call public history. And that's all the activities that are generated from and around the material assets of history that remain. And that's really immediate. It often happens in the present. It's about community projects. It's about how we use that material now and what people want from it, the questions that we ask of it. And the other form of practice that happens is this long-term, intergenerational, I've called professional practice, which sounds a bit exclusionary, but I don't know how to describe it. But it's people that are employed to look after, care for, collect, develop collections, whether that's multiple collections or buildings, for the long term. So what they're passing on to the next generation, that generation will ask entirely different questions than we ask, but their job is to pass that on. And their job is also to enable that work of the immediacy of public history or heritage. So that's kind of my model for thinking about that. And that was just a second model just to show how the historical assets, what we use kind of sits in the middle of those two forms of practice. So professional activity, wherever it sits, is enabling the work of the public, of public history. And that kind of releases that tension about, it makes you think about where funding goes, what you're funding in each of those different areas. We're often trying to use the wrong kinds of funding, I think, to fund different, we're trying to use funding for heritage to support professional practice and vice versa. Or we're trying to do, ask particular people to do step outside the roles and do different things. It just sets up a lot of tension, but once you realise that there's two activities operating in that one space, it makes things a lot clearer, and it kind of frees you up and enables you to do more things with that historical asset that we're all working with. So think about what public heritage is, public history, that's the tongue. I think it's complicated, conflicted, but engaging as ever. And it is really, isn't it, the use of history in the present. Thank you.
Is this one? Yes, it is. Answer is yes.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great. I'm going to stand. I'm more used to standing, probably because I'm quite short. So what I'd like to do is bring the public back into public history. Because I think this is a really important piece of this, and I think it's something that is very often not thought about, because we're all very busy in this sort of almost command and control, top-down hierarchy of history, which to some extent is really, really exclusionary. And I say this as someone who did a DPhil at Oxford, so I'm very, very aware of that juxtaposition. But I think we're really lucky in history because it is one of the most popular subjects. Most people are interested in it. They may not consider themselves a historian, they may not consider themselves to have any formal education in history, but I think by any definition we would say a lot of people are historians, and they have a passion. And we've all met people who might have been called amateurs, who know a great deal more and are a lot better at communicating it than some of those who are paid in the ivory towers to lecture us. So I think we can agree that there's a far bigger range of people that we're talking about if we're talking about the public in history. But I think public history, when I did my DPhil back in the last century, public history wasn't a formal thing. It was being done, and it's been done for centuries, but it just wasn't sort of brought into this whole idea of, there is a discourse around it, a narrative, and a methodology, etc. But I think you know, we see a lot of people doing their own private research, a lot of people with obsessions about various historical figures. And I'm thinking of my mum here, who's an absolute obsessive of John of Gaunt and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I think she sort of passed that on with the mother's milk there. I'm desperately, the only reason I became CEO of the Society of Genealogists was because I just wanted to prove that I was descended from John of Gaunt. It's really sad. I know that. Everybody wants to be descended from a royal, and I hate that. But you know, all of these people who are flocking to the National Trust, to English Heritage, to cathedrals at the weekend, all of these people are passionate people who are the public that we're talking about. And I'm not ashamed to say that I got into history through reading Jean Lady novels. I'm probably showing my age here. But, you know, it was a wonderful way of bringing those stories to life. And I remembered my history, because I remembered who was married to who divorced who, and, you know, who was having a bit of an argument with who, because it was presented to me as story. And we had faith in the fact that, you know, as with someone like Philippa Gregory, Alison Weir, that they were getting their facts right. And I think there's a huge kind of underplaying of mainly women who have written that type of historical novel that are actually responsible for a lot of us taking up a history degree further along the line. So I just like to pay tribute to those women. But it reminds me, I'm also a crafter, and it reminds me of this gap between artisans and crafters. You know, it's the gap between cooks and chefs. And so there's a whole range of people who are considered to be historians and validated as historians. And when I was meeting various people when I took up my role, I won't name any names, but the phrase, oh yes, historians could validate genealogists, happened in a conversation. And I wouldn't like to say that to any genealogist that I know, because it's an absolute insult. But it's an indication of how history sees genealogy. And that's really interesting, because family history and genealogy is probably one of the most popular areas of history. So if we ignore that at our peril, and I'll come back to that. But there is this gap to explore between formal history and formal historians and the rest of us, in a sense. And to some extent, those who are engaged in public history, those who are engaged in the formal side of history, again, are not necessarily reflective of the diversity of the UK. And it was interesting for me listening to Jessica talk about the work that she does, because my family comes from Barbados, I'm descended from slaves. This is a very real thing for me. So when I hear somebody talking about slavery or talking about the transatlantic slave trade, it's not just history, it's part of my history, and it's something that's very personal. And I think, you know, what we really do need to explore is how we bring communities. And I say we bring communities into this history. Again, that's the dynamic of the top-down hierarchy that we have. And I'm working with a range of trusts at the moment, because they want to do some reparatory work. And I'm really sorry for all the historians in here, but I actually changed the call for papers from being a purely academic call to saying, actually, you need to focus on communities and what they want, and how they want to see this reparatory work done. Not just employ another range of historians to write papers, have a community event, invite a few people in, and then impact it on. So I think we really do need to consider the public side of this far more. And this is one of the things about family history and genealogy that I absolutely love. I'm a complete convert. You know, I'm one of those people who's always said, oh, I want to do some family history, but you know, I did love to get my Polish passports. That was only a couple of generations back. But being at the Society of Genealogists has really enabled me to get to grips with genealogy and family history, but also see the passion of people. There's a huge community out there. And what I love about this community is that they are very collaborative and supportive for the most part, which is directly opposite to my experience when I was a historian. You know, my first conference when I was presenting a paper on Polish witchcraft, and quite an eminent German professor came up to me and wanted to know my list of sources. Now, fortunately, I wasn't naive enough to just hand them over to her, because the work I was doing was really groundbreaking. People hadn't looked at Polish witchcraft. But, you know, that's sort of, you know, again, I come back to the word hierarchy and I keep using it because I think we are still very much in that position, unfortunately. So I talk a little bit about family history, and there are people in this room who know far more about it than I do, so I encourage you to talk to them afterwards. We're looking at a group of people who are mostly self-taught, who will not necessarily have formal qualifications in an area of history. and people who are coming together to study local history. They're doing they're doing place studies, so focusing on a place, whether it's a hospital or a school or an area. They're looking at one-name studies, which could be tracing a name and a whole range of families that have that name. They're deploying so many different areas of history. And they're also looking at historical lives in a way that many historians don't ever get to do. And what I want to do is really to highlight this, is just to talk a little bit about some of the collections that we have at the Society of Genealogists, because I think this will help you to understand the links between the work that family historians do and history, and this at its most public form of history, I think. So, one of our founders, we were founded in 1911, was Percival Boyd, and he and his team indexed 8 million entries of people. And the indexes are of marriages, of London burials, and inhabitants of London. So you imagine that collective effort of people who are going around the country, transcribing records, producing indexes, all for everybody else to use. And that really is the sort of history of genealogy and family history, that you will have people out on a wet, crabby, horrible day in a cemetery, not as glamorous as it sounds, is it? Not just at Halloween, transcribing the tombstones, or making whole index, sitting there, inputting data into an index, really, really boring work, doing it, out of the sheer love. This is not about recognition. This is not about getting your names on papers or anything like that. This is about the sheer kind of altruism of saying, I found these interesting, so I know somebody else is going to want to do that. And that's, really, I think, what's at the heart of this. And it is, for me, history at its most democratic form and at its very, very public form. So we have, for example, collections, because we are an archive of last resort as well. We have collections on women in India. We have collections from the Caribbean, the Caribbeana, and histories of Antigua. We have Scottish collections. We have wills. We have births, deaths, marriages, all the sorts of things you would expect. Estate collections. We have a collection of Hyamson, who was the Director of Immigration in Palestine. Think of the papers in there, flicking through these folders and seeing what was actually going on at that time. And of course, we have our famous pedigree rolls. No talk about genealogy would be complete without, discussion of huge, great pedigree rolls. We have some that people have traced back to Adam. I'd love to see the sources on that one. Most people can get back to Charlemagne, let's face it, so I'm very confident about getting back to John of Gaunt. But, joking aside, this is really important because this is a form of social history that is one of the most prevalent in the world. We see 2 or 3 million people tune into Roots Tech every year in March. We see local history groups up and down the country that meet every month and are, able to commit. I'm a member of the Caribbean Family History Group, and what's been great about Zoom is that we can now talk to people in Barbados, in St Kitts and Nevis, etc., in America. It has an ability to also bring that diaspora together, and that's really important as well. And I'm gonna end now by really thinking about who are the gatekeepers in history, because the gatekeepers in history now are quite different to some of the gatekeepers that we had previously. We can think of the government as a gatekeeper in history at the moment. We can think about the huge institutions, academia itself, and those running academia. We can think about the media. There are a whole range of gatekeepers that we need to think about. And we do, as we know, have to be very aware of the problems that we have as an undisciplined discipline, I'd like to think of it as, in terms of diversity. Not just in terms of race, but in terms of other protected characteristics, but also class. We are still really not hitting that dial in terms of class. I remember there was a report out, and my colleague and I were both black, we both studied history, and I think it said something like, there were 4 people who were qualified to teach, 4 people who completed a history degree who were black. I'm like, well, that's 2 of us. This really brings it home. I think it's a perception as well. And there are lots of perceptions around history, and I think we do need to think about the difference between studying history as history and being a part of that history and knowing that that history is your history. And also how we feel about when other people talk about it, because that's also something we need to talk about when we're working with communities. So I think really that's all I have to say to really bring as I said, family history and genealogy into this conversation because I think it's really important, and I think there has traditionally been quite a rift between some historians and genealogists and family historians. Despite what I've said about John of Gaunt, that's my third time in a speech, I know. I am not, most genealogists are not obsessed with tracing their roots back to royalty. We are all in love with our ag labs, our agricultural labourers, and if we haven't got an agricultural labourer in our family, we do tend to get a little bit upset. We're very, very down to earth about this. So I think that's really all from me. I hope that it will encourage you to look at public history in a slightly different way. Of course, you're all welcome to visit the Society of Genealogists once we have our building bought. We're in that phase of things, but I would welcome you all to come and visit us next year when we'll have a range of launch activities, and I hope you think differently about family history activists. Thank you. Hello?
Oh, it's still on?
Yes.
Thank you so much to our three speakers, who I thought really did a wonderful job of representing sort of different angles, both from the, sort of where you're sitting, but also just in terms of what you reflected on. And we've got lots of time for questions. I think we do, at least. Yes, we do. We've got lots of time for questions. Excellent.
I'd like to ask a question to the three of you. Public history is not new, and you've mentioned that people have been doing art history in museums for years. So public history should not say that they're inventing the wheel, that's for sure. But what does it bring? I mean, if those things have been done for years, why are we talking about public history, and what does it add to the discussion? Does it add anything, or is it just trendy and we get funding? Which is cool, but is it changing something that we're talking about public history in your work, in your everyday work?
In my work, I don't think I've ever used the term public history, but I think definitely there has always been that ethos that it is for, about, by, or with the public. Because, as I said, that was the ethos that came into the profession. We felt like we were a public service. I'm trying to reflect and think what the difference is. I think there is a difference in that recognition of the desire for public output. I mean, lottery funding has got a lot to contribute to that, or has done a lot to push that forward. But also, I think that recognition that everybody's doing history and that we're all using the same material, but we're perhaps looking at it in different ways. And maybe public history is doing something about bringing those conversations together. Because I noticed that we've got heritage degrees and public history degrees. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is on any of them. I have to be honest. Is it just terminology? I mean, that's one of the questions that I have for you, I think, is there a difference, or is it just current terminology? And heritage is in a way quite an old word. A lot of the discussions that I hear now showing how this is a benefit becoming quite old suddenly, is that they are the same discussions that people had about heritage in some ways in the 80s. There is a lot of resonance between them, and I just wonder if maybe it reflects how far we have come, because it's easy to forget how much change there has been. I mean, I've certainly sat in a room where I'm not the only female, without a beard, and certainly when I went to my current job, which was only 10, 12 years ago now. I was the only woman in a group of 5, 6 curators that covered the whole of the Southwest, and now there is only one man. And that's quite an interesting reflection, because of course it also reflects the democratisation of these ideas and the use of it, but maybe it also reflects the kind of devaluing in lots of ways, that actually it does come down to everybody's involved, everyone's doing it, but nobody's quite sure how to manage it. And do we need to manage it anyway? Is it just something that people do? So it's a bit rambling. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I reflected on that this morning, and I thought I haven't got a clue what public history is. I mean, I think I know what it is, but I don't know what it is as a sort of, as I said, academicised, or whatever you say, subject, because it's my concept of public history is history that's done in public, either for, with, or by the public, and that's pretty huge, really. I think there's partly a justification, you were talking about the financial side of it, I think there's partly a justification which says if we are giving government money to heritage or history or any output, then we need to make sure that we can involve as much of the public as possible, otherwise it's basically just a sort of old gentleman's club, which a lot of these areas have been. I'll be very worried about the sort of, the feminisation of any profession brings with it a downgrading in pay. So, we do see this, and that's always a worry. But I think public history is something that's always been done, always will be done. But what is the benefit of categorising it in a different way? I don't understand myself why, as you said, there's this whole sort of different concept of public history when it draws upon so many other things. I mean, maybe it just is that collaborative nature. Which is not a bad thing, of bringing the material and the academic and the community together. But I'm not convinced it's actually doing that. So, what is the purpose? I think is a great question.
Yeah, so I've got public history in my job title, so I should really have an answer to this, And similarly, one of the questions that I was asked multiple times, clearly not answering particularly well in my job interview, was what is public history? Gave all of these kind of probably quite academic answers, quoting the Miller joining over and various people, and I think, it came back to this question, well, what is it to you? And actually, for me, I think there is something that can be. And as we said, it can be lots of things, but there is something that can be quite radical in some ways about it. It can be about bringing people together, about questions of social justice and representation that perhaps haven't always been covered in other areas. And I suppose just as a sort of devil's advocate sort of position, maybe the vagaries of the term are good. Maybe there are positive things about this in that, public history is quite hard to pin down. It changes over time. It can encompass genealogy and antiquarians and people on TikTok and various other things I don't quite understand. And maybe that's good. Maybe the flexibility, the malleability, the fluidity of public history as a term is quite good, and maybe it's pushed it in sort of slightly different areas. And I think there is a historical dominance of the terminology and language around heritage, particularly in this country, that comes from a place of quite tangible archaeological, backgrounds and remains and the management and conservation of those areas. And that's shifted over time, which is a good thing. But perhaps the introduction of history as a word into that also then foregrounds the historical discipline and all the many hands that go to make history.
Thank you. I'm going to take slight chair's privilege because what you've been saying, the question really made me recall something. So I just stepped down, but for many years was the director of the Raphael Samuel History Center, and I'm also on the editorial collective History Workshop Journal, with which it's affiliated. And I remember really well about a decade ago, or maybe 7 years ago, when I stepped into the role at the Raph Sam Center, suggesting to change its name to the Raphael Samuel Center for Public History. And the crowd over at History Workshop really resisted that. And at first I was annoyed by that, but I've fully come around. But what was really interesting is that some of the arguments against it that they were making were that public history sounds so official, it sounds so institutional, because that word public in a UK context does sort of inflect that a little bit more than it would in the American context where the term was born, in an institutional American context. So I was really interested in that, and sort of the conversation was far-reaching, but we kind of ended up at their belief that really public history is just social history, that social history well done should actually, and you mentioned the word social history, Wanda, and yeah, so that was, I recalled that conversation as you were speaking, and I kind of wish I wrote it down.
So this obviously, I also have public history in my job title. I'm a lecturer in public history, so I'm supposed to teach people about what this thing is. And over the years, I think I've thought a lot about your questions on this, about what does it add, what is the use of this? Because my own PhD is, while in history, was very much drawing from critical heritage studies. And I think for me now, I've arrived at this understanding of public history as a critical disciplinary orientation to history, thinking about the word public not within that kind of public value, public service language that we might use in the UK, but as a way of acknowledging the many hands, the distribution of power, thinking through authority, thinking through expertise, thinking through kind of the disciplinary foundations of evidentiality, for example, authenticity, integrity, and how they might be reframed around this idea of shared authority in the public. So that's my kind of go-to now, is this kind of critical disciplinary orientation. That for me encapsulates what it means to me to be a public historian as opposed to a historian within that disciplinary box.
Thank you. That's a good question. If what's public history is the opposite of public history.
So I want to ask a question, sort of follows on from that, I guess, about the place of emotions in public history. I think this came from partly listening to Wanda talking about coming to history through historical novels and attachment to particular historical figures, and that was very much also my own experience, and finding community in history when you don't necessarily have community in the present, but also listening to both Jessica and Wanda talking about kind of painful histories like the history of enslavement. And I'm wondering, do we tend to think of kind of emotions as not belonging to real history, so we displace them into public history and that's where they go? And conversely, like, is emotion one of the things that academics think devalues public history, or particularly forms of it like genealogy? Really interested in any of your reflections on that kind of thing.
I got very emotional reading through 200 trials of men and women who were being tortured and tried for witchcraft. I won't deny it. I would take a tissue with me into the archives because I didn't want my tears to go onto the ink of a 16th century court record book, obviously. I think for me there's a difference between that general emotion that you feel when you're dealing with a particularly horrible history, and there's a different emotion that I felt when, in between my son, picking my son up from football, I was just scrolling along on my phone through Ancestry, found a record, or it might have been Family Search, others are available, found a record of one of my ancestors who was a freed Negro but who held slaves. Now, I wasn't prepared for how I would feel about that, because that's a very, very ambiguous and quite emotional situation to be in. So I think one of the things when we're looking at family history is that we always have to be very aware that we will find things out about our ancestors, or we will find out that people weren't our ancestors. This is just a shout out for anyone doing DNA tests. Don't do it unless you're really sure you want to know things. You have to be really prepared for that emotionally. And so I think actually that's a real strength in the family history community, that we know we are so connected to these people that we will feel something. When I saw 2 babies registered, one didn't survive. That felt very personal to me. So I think there are different ways of dealing with emotion when you're dealing with history. I think there's a very fine line between historical probity, the probity of a historian and the integrity of a historian, and emotion sometimes. And I think it's how we navigate that's really, really important, because unfortunately we are seeing a whole range of people claiming to be historians, or who are actually historians, who are not sticking to that kind of probity and integrity, and they're doing that publicly, and I think that's really devaluing history, unfortunately. So, it is our job to uphold that first principle of being a historian.
Yes, emotions. I think it's really interesting in that maybe we could say that people who are engaged with doing public historical work in various sort of forms are more honest about that emotional engagement that is there anyway. And more in tune with the way that things make us think and feel differently, or the way that we react to episodes in the past and how that reverberates on the present. And there are some people that are more in tune to that than others. And I think that, in a way, there is also a strange marshalling of emotions that are seen as legitimate and those that are not. And I think that emotion can I think a lot of the time people forget that anger is also an emotion, or frustration is also kind of an emotion. So there is this sort of spectrum of emotions, some of which are seen as, not the appropriate way to respond to the past as a historian, and some are seen as perfectly legitimate. And I think, I'm sure we've all come up against this in various ways in our own practices. But I think there's an interesting kind of marshalling of appropriate emotions and not appropriate emotions, and also a sort of expectation that history should be presented in a certain kind of dispassionate way as well. But I also wonder if maybe this is kind of changing at this moment.
I guess I wonder whether public history is the term that we use, just using to label how we choose to look at history and use history at the moment, and don't doubt that it will change again. And it's perhaps we're just interested, every things change, don't they? We're just interested in asking different questions, essentially of the same material, over time. And I think, maybe that's just what we're interested in at the moment. We're interested in emotions and other sides of things, and the next, in 10 years' time, different group will sit here and ask different questions, and I think that's okay. That's completely fine. And but there is an importance, I think, as Wanda was alluding to, of retaining the integrity of the material that we ask those questions of, or the information that we're using to base those discussions on. And really, as long as that's kind of that's the wrong word, cared for, nurtured, then you can ask any questions you like, and that's all good. Thank you. Yeah, of course.
Sorry, just sort of wanted to reflect on that. And I think, some of the key changes over the last 10 or 20 years have been the diversification of access to these materials. So, I have a good example. We have a lot of colonial records at the Society of Genealogists. They've generally been looked at by white people who, we actually do have a book called My Ancestors Settled in the West Indies. Now, that's not how I would phrase it. It won't be reprinted under that title in my tenure. But, that's a good example of the same records being looked at different people, and part of my role is to ensure that the rest of us can actually look at those records. And painful as it is to see ourselves in slave registers or compensation registers or really harrowing accounts, this is how we find our history. And so I think over the last 10 or 20 years, just as there's a turn with women's history and gender, we are now seeing that, actually we're interrogating history from a different perspective. And, my big plea is, can we teach other black history other than slavery? Because our kids are growing up with assemblies on slavery and nothing else. I'm not seeing, we don't teach Jewish history just through the Holocaust, but through the Holocaust. It is a very important part, obviously, but we do teach about the writers, the creators, the novelists. Can we please do that for black history as well?
Sorry. Before we move on from the topic, a great question about emotions, and I think linked to that, and it links to something Wanda and Barbara said about integrity and ethics. Because I learned my ethics from family historians. Absolutely. When I was thinking of my sort of ethical position as a historian writing microhistory, it wasn't from academic history that I turned, that I got that sort of sense of ethics. It was absolutely through family historians. And I remember that when I was doing an impact thing for my last project on trafficking, the reviewer of the application quite rightly queried why I hadn't gotten ethical approval for my impact activities, which were going to be working with vulnerable migrants. And I said, well, that's a very good point. And I went and I looked, and the AHRC, which is the main funder for arts and humanities in the UK, does not have ethical guidelines for impact activities. And I just thought that really points to a really, really large gap in what we're saying public history is, and then like the sort of things that are put in place to sort of think about the ethics and emotions of it. So yeah, that's, I think, a telling anecdote.
Something Wanda said really got me thinking, but it's relevant to all of you. I think to the conference in general, you really emphasise, rightly I think, that barriers continue between people in academia who are historians, and including self-proclaimed public historians, and the general public, or sections of the public. gatekeeping persists. And certainly if you look at people within academia, especially humanities departments or history departments, they don't reflect the wide diversity of British society, even at the most junior level. And I think in terms of class, we're probably going backwards. You know, it's worse now than it was 10 years ago in terms of access for working class people in this country. Having said that though, I do wonder, and I talk about this with students that do the MA in public history at my place, there's sometimes a danger that we can fetishize the public and sort of assume that the average man and woman in the street is always kind of right, or you know, their ideas, their thoughts, their feelings about history are always okay. I used to work for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and most of the history there is the two world wars. And people's capacity for self-righteousness, indignation, sanctimony, anger when it comes to the World War, especially the Second World War in this country, is pretty much limitless. And I definitely encountered prejudice and bigotry. You know what Julie mentioned at the start there about ideas and language that are bigoted or prejudiced or downright racist. The public, there's lots of that stuff out there in the public. So I suppose what I'm asking is there, for all three of you, drawing on your experiences, have you encountered this? Is there a way of negotiating this? Is there a way of maybe, I don't know, do you have a philosophy about how you deal with that, or do you not think it's an issue?
As someone who spent their lifetime working with the public, I think you're entirely right. I think you only have to look at how the heritage of World War I is being constructed now, in a way that those who fought in the war and lived through the war probably never have done that. You know, you only have to, I mean, I drove through past enormous mural in the middle of the countryside the other day of, you know, allegedly a battlefield of World War I. Just randomly, you know, those people didn't come home and do that. So I think there's something really interesting about, well, it comes back to the same thing. People are constructing their own idea of history in the present. But from somebody that has spent their time working in one way or another with the public, my own experience and my research shows that actually there is an enormous amount of power of what I would call grassroots, but that kind of encompasses all those people that you're talking about who don't work, who aren't employed, and we, or you, may beat yourself up about the fact that you're an academic or from a particular background or whatever, but actually there is an equivalent amount of power with those people who you might call as amateurs, hobbyists, you know, experts, and actually the exclusionary nature of those projects, community projects. I mean, you must have experienced how those are actually often more exclusionary than things that, I mean, as somebody that worked for the lottery fund for 13 years or something, the number of projects I saw where people worked so hard to engage with people, bring people in. Nobody's making people in small projects or creating their own history groups do that. And, you know, there is an enormous amount of power at that level, which is entirely unrecognised because it's disaggregated across that, you know, rather than in one place with a big museum or something, it's that power is spread across individuals, groups, local history societies, community projects, and they are horribly exclusionary quite often, actually. So.
Yeah, I think there's a similar kind of issue with the way that the word community is often adopted, as if it's always this lovely, fluffy, holding hands, dancing around, having a nice time, everyone's getting on kind of situation. And of course, we know that in reality, communities are about tension and about power and about, you know, all this, because it's about people. And that's what people are like, and there's nothing that should be particularly surprising about that. I think sometimes there's a bit of condescension where you think about, oh, public, that's a nice fluffy thing, community, that's a nice fluffy thing, and it doesn't do justice to the real work that needs to happen if we really believe in, you know, bringing good, meaningful and ethically produced histories to a broader audience, or to working with people to co-create those things, if we're sort of thinking about them in these purely positive terms. So I think there is a sense of responsibility in just understanding the reality on the ground. And some of that I think we can draw from things like heritage studies and theorisation, about going back to just that idea of, well, why are people so fascinated and interested in this in the first place? You know, we think back to those ideas of, yes, heritage is a process of present day identity construction. People draw on the past in order to create a sense of self, a sense of meaning. That happens at different levels, you know, community level, but also national level, identity level as well. And that all those things crash together and kind of create this really complex mess of society and how these things work. But also that, I suppose, and just thinking through current and emerging tensions around culture wars, the histories of particularly race, enslavement and empire and colonialism, but lots of other things as well, people have been encouraged to think a certain way about the past. That those people that you come across, Edward, that are, you know, talking about the Second World War as this amazing, heroic thing that Britain did, as you know, the people's history, as Lucy Noakes has sort of analysed, are doing so because that has been set up for them by the various apparatus of heritage and memory structures as well.
I think it's a really great question, and I think actually I would flip it a little bit and say it's definitely not just in the public. There's a reason why I know far more black people with doctorates who are not in academia than who are. So, you know, we need to recognise that as well. As the granddaughter of a Polish airman in the Second World War, excluding people from narratives is really, you know, really hits home. I mean, we're only really now talking about why the Poles were not allowed to march in the Victory Day parade. You know, a whole range of histories that are becoming more known because of social media, because of populations changing, because of more people having access to history and other people's narratives. But I do think there's a danger in a kind of, you know, this is the one truth, which I'm not saying that you're saying that, but, you know, how the use of history is such a contentious issue on all sides. So I think we have to be a little bit wary of saying history can do this, or education can do this, because, you know, we very much in terms of anti-racism work, people are very keen on saying we have to educate people. You know, we have to educate prejudice out. Now, some of you might remember that when there was a big campaign on wearing seatbelts in cars. You know, it wasn't the education that made people put their seatbelts on, it was the threat of a fine. So, you know, let's not override the pudding when it comes to education. And I think, you know, we have to be honest about people's engagement in history. It might just be they want to go to a lovely house and, you know, they've watched a few TV programmes, or they particularly like watching the Tudors or, you know, Rome or something like that. I'm showing my age now. And they just really enjoy it. And they love, you know, they love the dressing up and stuff. So there are very, very many different ways in which people enjoy history, and I think that's absolutely the beauty of it.
Could I also add something? I mean, is it worth putting my other slide up?
Yeah, sure. It's very easy
Just
to
to
do.
say, you know, so much of what we're talking about is box in the middle, what's happening right now. That's how people are using history. Maybe that's what public history is. But one of the interesting things about that, and all that amazing activity, great activity, people should use history as much as possible, do whatever they like with it really, but actually a lot of it does not impact on the long-term collections, adding to collections and collections care. You know, to quote a colleague in a large regional museum who had a difficult issue with some kind of, you know, local history group or something, wanting to acquire something, but she was like, well, that's great, let them get on with it, but, you know, in 20 years' time they'll be gone and we'll still be here. And we are holding that collection for the next people who want to use it. So particularly for the, you know, some of the things that the National Trust do, and I look at it in terms of interpretation, and they have to kind of swallow hard and think, oh my goodness, but then actually it will be gone by Friday. You know, I have to think differently. I'm thinking, I'm trying to encourage this bit in the middle and what happens, and I want everyone to, obviously, I would love for people to engage with history and use history, and I want as many voices as possible, because that's what it's about, as many viewpoints as possible. But actually I'm thinking intergenerationally, I'm also thinking about, you know, where it's been 50 years' time.
Up here thinking about, this actually rolls back to the slightly early, well, the first question about what is public history, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of another academic discipline that has a subsection with the word public in front of it. We don't talk about public geography or public psychology or public sociology. Sorry,
there's public archaeology.
Oh, is there?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And there is public art, which, but there you're sort of talking about the public-facing works of art rather than art within a museum, I think. And maybe, there's something about that which goes back to Ron's point about that this is part of a kind of shared human experience, a shared way of being human, just like artistic imagination is a shared human capacity, historical imagination is as well. So that was just a thought, but I wondered about how, for each of you, the imaginative realm kind of impacts on the way that you think about what you do, and also for people that Mr. Rickard do.
I think that because, my job is about creating exhibitions and displays and all that kind of thing, and actually thinking about different ways to engage people with collections, and that could be very traditional, it could be really unusual, it could be through any of the senses. It's also about enabling other people to use that, and that's often quite a creative approach, and actually certainly for the National Trust in trying to address some of the more challenging aspects of the history of the places that it looks after, using the creative arts is actually a really productive way to do that. I don't want to say comfortable because it's not comfortable, but it's coming to things. So, for example, if you're working with an artist to try and think about a place or an object or something, it's almost like coming through a third party. Using creativity to think about things in a different way can bring different groups together to the same starting point, and it helps. It's thinking about things with the imagination and creativity certainly helps you to find shared experience and a different way to think about things, which is, I think, really helpful in this very challenging environments.
Yes, and I'm involved in a project at the moment that's looking at forms of creative memorialisation through dance and digital augmented reality art. I would pretend to understand all of the ins and outs of that, but I think one of the other things that's useful, I agree with Barbara about the value of art and creativity as a way of adding to and exploring particularly difficult histories. Sometimes, you need more. And art can allow you to go into different areas. But I think it's also a way of valuing different types of knowledge as well. And so if we are interested in decolonial praxis and sort of ways of approaching subjects in new ways, then I think creativity, as long as it's valued, I think can be a really useful way of navigating different types of knowledge about the past that haven't necessarily been valued in the past. And I think dance is a really interesting example of that. So the project I'm involved in at the moment sort of looks at African diasporic dance as a way of knowing place and people and history, but also kind of exploring and countering that as well. And I think that creativity is a really interesting part of what is public history now. I actually said the name of the conference. But I do think we're at an interesting moment where those things are kind of being thought through, creative histories as well, and sort of ways of approaching that.
I think the beauty of history as well is that it is all about stories and experience and life, and I think you will find every aspect of life in history. One of the things about family history that I love at that sort of artistic level is, we have these wonderful pedigree rolls, we have a beautiful collection, the Lucas collection, which has got this absolutely stunning goldwork embroidery around the book, and it has these fantastic illustrations of the house, of coats of arms. I mean, if you're into heraldry, we are the place to be. But also the little notes that go in there. So we are currently digitising, we had a grant from Art Fund, we're currently digitising over 10,000 of these pedigree rolls. Now they're not all beautiful sort of 6-foot ones lined and backed by silk, which we'll hope to exhibit in our new home. But some of them have these little comments on them. There was one that said, this man was drunk and disparate and gambled his fortune away. And then, 2 generations down, it says, his grandson managed to get their lives back together and to restore the reputation of the drunkard grandfather. And it's wonderful things like this. There's episodes in a billiard room that I really can't go into in public that are noted down on these things. So it's these wonderful snippets of people's lives where you just get this insight. You can create a novel from that. You can create poetry. You can create, what I'd love to do is have an artist in residence, or maybe a dancer in residence. Now I'm thinking about that, dance genealogy discuss. But there's so much in there because people are able to represent their own histories, and so they will bring their own creativity to that, and it's really a joy for us to see these things in the records. It's the marginalia, isn't it? It's when you're reading an old Bible and somebody's written God knows what in this side of it, but it's those moments for me that are really, really those kind of real interaction moments when you're having you're in a dialogue in a sense with somebody 200 or 300 years ago, and that's for me is always been magic.
Thank you. So we're running out of time, so I think what we're going to have to do is collect questions that have no answers. So sort of comments, questions, welcome, but we'll just collect them up to hold in our heads to carry forward into the next session.
Thank you so much for all the papers. We don't have time, so I won't go more in detail. But I'm a historian. I came into public history through public engagement with research, which is kind of this more wide-ranging, interdisciplinary attempt to not be just an isolated ivory tower, academic ivory tower. And so I was wondering if we could, I cannot answer to my question now, but if we could reflect more on the engagement aspect of public history and what responsibility and accountability comes from there, and what could be best practices. And I think that's one of the panels that's followed shortly. I might be able to answer my questions, so I'll just leave it there. And thank you very much.
Yeah, I was just about to say that's something that can carry into the collaboration, because we've said collaboration, but engagement's slightly different, isn't it? So, yeah, thank you.
I work with a lot of artists who are very engaged with the historical, and we talk about, I think when I studied my MA for public history, there was a lot of the potential for art and the crossover. Artists think about history a lot, but they certainly don't engage with it in the same way that you would in an academic setting, or even in a well-infused grassroots setting a lot of the time. I work with a lot of artists who love historical figures, characters, moments to get them going, but the sort of like deep-level research that they might commit to, say it's theatre, a piece of movement, or even how a character might hold themselves, is not that level does not translate into their sort of research around their historical stuff. A lot of them will stop at Wikipedia, which there's nothing wrong with as a sort of starting point, of course, it's not to criticise, but that's where a lot of them will stop. And I guess something I've been reflecting on a lot, and I did workshops on it recently, have been leading workshops on it recently, is how do we bridge that gap between different historical communities and artists who are really enthused by it, because it seems like as historians we're very passionate about bringing artists in, and artists are very passionate about working with history, but there doesn't actually seem to be that much collaboration or talking between those different communities. Yeah, I guess just reflecting more widely on how do we do that more effectively.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and another one for the collaboration panel to put in there, sort of heads to talk about.
I've been puzzling over the diagram I'm looking at, because I've also, the first history conference I ever went to was a public history conference, and I did my bit of academic work on family history, but I've never called myself a public historian, and I've always been pondering what it is, so I'm feeling very relieved that other people are also doing that. But I'm finding also the diagram really interesting. I know it's about time frame and time spans, but in where I think the work I do and work with lots of academic and community groups in and bringing out archival stories and gathering you in, is about the two boxes, the two pink boxes, and how they work together, and actually disrupting those time frames. Because actually when we work in collaboration with community groups, it massively enhances my understanding of stories within the oral history archive I look after. But I think when it works, and it doesn't always work, but when it works you've got a change in the kind of perception of history from the people who are there, maybe only for that particular project and won't be any others. So I know that's not what your diagram's about, but it's been making me think about those different ways we interact, and for me that's the exciting space. I've got to look after conservation, long-term cataloguing, all that kind of stuff, which is professional and is sometimes very dull, but is very important. But it's that magic that happens when you've got those two boxes and how they link together, and working out how to make them work together and how to make those conversations happen in the best way.
Including into the future, which I think we're going to touch on a little bit in our panel, or our on-conferencing session on the future of public history. And lastly,
So and I also have my own podcast. And what I've noticed is quite a lot of people, when you ask them questions in an oral history interview, they don't really believe that what they're saying is going to be useful, important to future generations, and they also don't necessarily believe what they're saying is actually of any use or any interest to anybody, or is in any way historically accurate. When you interview people, they often question, like, I can't remember the exact date, you need the exact date, you need the exact facts, because that's how they were taught history in school. And also podcasting as well. I'm quite surprised to see that a lot of the history podcasts that I see that are championed and profiled a lot are professional historians talking about history. And I sometimes feel that those professional historians already have a platform in terms of documentaries, in terms of being published in publications, teaching in universities. And what I'm really interested to hear more about, in your opinions, if you have any ideas, is about the sort of democratizing effect of oral history and of podcasting, where people are telling their own histories, which may be biased, they may be fractured memories, they may not be necessarily taught history in the same way that people at school would. I don't know if that was a really good question.
No, that's a really good point. And actually, I don't think I made enough space to talk about social media, podcasting, and the alternate media in the conference. So I've made a mental note to explore it through blogs. But it's a really good point that I think we can take forward through the rest of the conference to discuss.